Hello and welcome. It's one of the world's oldest professions, a gun for hire. But being a mercenary in today's world, especially in a place like Iraq, is a lot more complicated. Huge sums of money are involved when it comes to private military companies, and the role they play could have serious implications that go beyond the actual fighting on the ground.
Mercenary, to me, is somebody who goes and fights and gets paid for it, for a cause that is not necessarily for his country or his nation.
They are unemployed soldiers looking for a way to make a living using the only skills they have, which are these military skills.
There's a fundamental difference between an ordinary soldier and a mercenary, if I may use that term. An ordinary soldier who fights under a flag for a particular country has a legitimate use of force, allowing that individual to engage in activities which normally would be considered either criminal or, strictly speaking, murderous, whereas a mercenary lacks that immediate social justification.
That was a clip from the documentary Shadow Company. One US firm providing mercenary forces for Iraq is Blackwater, which has 20,000 soldiers on the ready, the world's largest private military base, and a fleet of 20 aircraft, including helicopter gunships. We'll look at the growth and the use of these private security firms on today's show. Now, don't forget, we take your questions. The numbers are there at the bottom of your screen. Well, joining me to discuss the often secretive world of mercenaries is Jeremy Scahill, an investigative journalist who also reports for the television and radio program Democracy Now! Mr. Scahill recently published Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army. He's joining us from New York. And joining us from Los Angeles is the director and producer of Shadow Company, Nick Bicanic. Mr. Bicanic is also the co-founder of the production company Purpose Films. Gentlemen, good to have you both with us.
It's good to be with you, Riz.
Jeremy Scahill, if I could start with you. Thank you. Jeremy, if I could start with you and ask you, why should anyone be worried about the US government using mercenary forces?
Well, I think most people in the United States and indeed in the world think that there are between 130,000 and 145,000 U.S. troops that are occupying Iraq. What's often left out of that equation is the fact that there are 126,000 private contractors, tens of thousands of whom are armed mercenary forces. General David Petraeus, a senior military commander, said that the occupation wouldn't be possible without these private forces. And so what the Bush administration has done is to wage a shadow war by sending mercenary forces into Iraq to effectively double the size of the occupation force. Their deaths don't get counted in the official toll, their injuries don't get counted, and there's no effective laws governing their presence in Iraq. And so we literally don't know the crimes that these forces are committing. We do know that 655,000 Iraqis have been killed. The military forces are subjected to the court-martial system. The mercenaries are subjected to no effective Iraqi law, U.S. law, or international law.
Actually, Jeremy, that's what I was going to ask you, is how accountable are they? I mean, in what way can they be made accountable? Surely there must be some kind of regulation for them coming on board under the U.S. military auspices.
Well, this is a very serious problem, particularly in Iraq. We've had tens of thousands of contractors that have gone in and out of Iraq since March of 2003 when the U.S. invasion began. Only 2 private contractors have been indicted or charged with any crime. So either we have the most saintly mercenaries running around Iraq or something is very rotten with that system. Now, this is a very hot debate right now in the U.S. Congress, and there's a real question on whether the court-martial system should be applied to them or if U.S. law should be applied to them. But regardless of what the legal system ends up being, the fact is I don't think that there could be any legal system that could effectively govern 130,000 private actors in a war zone.
Well, Nick Bicanic, if I could get you in there from Los Angeles, congratulations on making Shadow Company. In that, you say that the rules of war have changed. In what way?
Well, it's essentially a version of what the answer that Jeremy gave you. The rules of war have changed because if for the U.S. Army alone and for many other Western armies, it's simply not possible to wage a war of the scale that's being waged in Iraq without the usage of private actors. It is worth mentioning that in Iraq alone, a significant percentage of the private security contractors that are operating there are not actually American. It's always tempting to assume that simply because of the fact that they're employees who are connected in some way to the American forces there, that they're absolutely all American citizens. That's not the case. There's a significant number of Iraqis, and in fact, Iraqi-owned private security companies, which doesn't necessarily make the problem smaller, but it does make it different, because in many instances, it's the locals that are taking a lot of these jobs and even starting up these companies to get involved there.
Now, why mercenaries have been around for a long time, Nick, and I wonder why is the role of these private military companies so important now?
Well, it's somewhat of an anomaly that we perceive it as a strange thing, because it's only really in the last 150 or maybe a tiny bit more years that non-nation state actors have been considered a strange thing. I mean, the phenomenon of the nation state and one of its building blocks being an army that defends its borders is a fairly recent phenomenon in terms of major history. So in medieval times, and in fact way earlier than that, mercenary forces have been a key part of all warfare. Is history turning around? Are we heading in that direction again? Will private companies be a component of a new version of the UN? Who knows? But it's one of the many phenomena that we set out to explore in Shadow Company.
Well, before we get back to Jeremy, Nick, let's have another look at Shadow Company in a clip here, which looks at the monopoly, I guess, of the armies there. This one, I guess, looks at the way perhaps that private armies have been taking over standard army operations. Let's have a look.
The army used to take care of everything. They used to be a self-contained operation. When they went to war, they had all the skills, all the personnel, all the materials. When they began downsizing the military, they simply outsourced things they needed, whether it was technology or security.
It's basically the way we look at the role of the public versus the private, and that's changed over time. People looked at areas of government and said, the market should be doing that. And that was things like education, private prisons, garbage collection, private security. And the final frontier of that was the military. It was the monopoly of the military over the realm of force, and that monopoly has been broken with the private military industry.
Let's get to Jeremy Scahill, who's joining us from New York. And Jeremy, in your book, Blackwater, which is obviously very thoroughly researched, you seem to really be convinced that Blackwater as a company is the product or the lifetime's work of Donald Rumsfeld, the former Defense Secretary, and Vice President Dick Cheney here in the U.S. Why are you so sure of that?
Well, I think that we've seen these forces used to double the size of the occupation force, as I said, wage a shadow war. And the fact is that the Bush administration failed to build a coalition of willing nations to invade and occupy Iraq. And so it turned to Blackwater and its other friends from the coalition of billing corporations and staffed the occupation that way. Blackwater portrays itself as an all-American operation, but the fact is that they have deployed mercenaries from Chile in Iraq, some of whom trained and served under the brutal regime of Augusto Pinochet. They've deployed Colombian forces, Polish forces, Bulgarian forces. And the fact is that Blackwater is headed by a man, Eric Prince, who's a significant bankroller of President Bush's political campaigns, the Republican causes, and he has very deep connections to the movements that make up the Christian right in the United States. This is a very frightening development in the history of the use of these mercenary forces, to have a man at the helm of a company who's on the board of Christian Freedom International, an evangelical missionary organization that says that the Bible is the only infallible word of God. To have these kinds of forces deploying in Iraq, a Muslim country, I find very disturbing.
But Jeremy, there is an interesting paradox here, isn't there? If they're mercenaries, they're supposed to be up for sale at I guess, to the highest bidder, or at least if the bill is paid. There would be no ideological aspect to them. There would be just whoever pays the bill, irrespective of who they are, would be able to buy them. Is that correct?
Well, see, what Blackwater has done is it's taken the traditional mercenary motive of money and it's swirled it together with the sort of neo-patriotic justification for serving in this so-called global war on terror. Blackwater relies heavily on the belief among its forces that what they're doing is serving their country. Now, the fact of the matter is that the majority of Americans are now opposed to the war in Iraq. The majority of the world is now opposed to the war in Iraq. And so what Blackwater is doing is providing forces to engage in an offensive occupation, a war of conquest. And I think it's very frightening that when the nation state fails to provide sufficient forces for its army or its military, you can have an administration like the Bush administration turn to the private sector to fuel a war that his own population is against.
Was that, Jeremy, was that the most disturbing thing you came across as you researched Blackwater? Or was there something that really, stuck with you, that this is really quite disturbing?
Well, I think that this nexus of the religious right, the closeness to the Bush administration, the fact that Blackwater has among its senior ranks some former senior officials from the Bush administration, people like Kofor Black, who head of the CIA's Counterterrorism Center, Joseph Schmitz, who was the former Pentagon Inspector General. When you mix together these connections with the current administration, with the radical Christian right agenda of some of the Blackwater executives, and then you look at the fact that this private army is being deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan, other Muslim countries, I find that to be a very disturbing trend, and Blackwater is certainly at the cutting edge of it.
Well, Nick Bicanic, if I can get you back in from Los Angeles and say, you were, a lot of your interest was generated by the story of Fallujah, where four soldiers charred bodies were hanging from a bridge, and it turns out those were actually private contractors as opposed to regular U.S. soldiers. Let's just look at a little more clip from what happened in Fallujah from Shadow Company.
جاء أحد المجاهدين الذي يعمل في قسم الاستخبارات في الجيش الإسلامي وأخبر آمر سريتنا بأن عناصر من CIA سيمرون على طريق الفلوجة الرئيسي ذاهبين إلى مقاعدة الحبانية.
You have to remember something. Most insurgents think the contractors work for the CIA. In that particular case, I think the contractors were the target. And I think that the reason they were killed and mutilated was because they wanted to show, they had the chance to intercept them, and they wanted to show that they were winning the war against the CIA, not Blackwater or contractors.
فانقضوا على السيارة المتأخرة فقتلوا من فيها وهرب صاحب السيارة الأولى إلى الجهة المقابلة.
Nick, what was it about that incident in Fallujah that really triggered your interest in wanting to pursue this to the point where you made the documentary, you got so involved in the story?
Well, the fascinating thing about Fallujah was, for me, and I'm sure many other people, that the original assumption of seeing these mutilated bodies was that they were U.S. soldiers. And then when it became clear that they were in fact civilian contractors who were, as it happens, employed by the company that Jeremy was talking about, Blackwater USA, that was a really interesting turn of events, especially when the U.S. Army had a fairly aggressive response to the aftermath of the incident. The idea of the U.S. Army responding to the deaths of armed civilians in such fashion was a fascinating phenomenon. But I would like to pick up on something that Jeremy said earlier. I think that there's a significant problem with looking at Blackwater and, in fact, the private military industry in general as a product of the current administration. It's an overly simplistic view, because whatever the administration in the U.S., private military companies have existed significantly before the current one and will continue to exist after one. The idea that somehow that they're a product of Bush, Cheney, and all the other people who are currently in power is a fallacy, and I think it does a disjustice to better understanding for the general public, to better understanding how this industry works and how complicated it is.
Well, Riz, just to respond to what Nick is saying, I lay this out in my book that it's part of a very deep history, and it certainly is not simply a product of this administration. What I say in my book is that this administration has maximized its use of these private forces in Iraq. Let's look at what happened at that Fallujah ambush. The fact is that the Bush administration ordered a total leveling of the city of Fallujah after those four Blackwater contractors were killed. Hundreds of Iraqis were killed. The U.S. carried out 37,000 airstrikes. The whole city of Fallujah was destroyed over the deaths of four private soldiers. And I should say that the families of those four men have filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Blackwater, saying that the company sent them on that mission that day in unarmored vehicles, short on weapons, and short 2 men. And that's a case that very well could be groundbreaking, and it's going to be heard in state court in the state of North Carolina. So this is part of a trajectory that's been in motion for many, many decades. What I say is that the Bush administration, in many ways, has maximized its use of these forces, both on the ground in Iraq and in the public relations war at home.
Jeremy, I want you to answer an email that we got here from Lorraine in London. What Lorraine says is, it could be said that private security companies are safer since they include many nationalities with no prejudice. However, the prejudice of money is a great leveler. I guess she's saying it's money driven, but she says they could be actually less riddled with prejudices because of their diverse nationalities. What would you say to that, Jeremy?
No, I don't think that that's one of the key factors at all. I think one of the scariest things about the use of these forces is that there's no accountability, there's no effective oversight or transparency to their operations. I've talked to several members of Congress who've tried to get detailed information on the operations of Blackwater and other companies, and they're totally shrouded in secrecy. So the biggest concern, I think, here on the ground is that A, the Bush administration is using unaccountable private forces to wage a war that the American people oppose, and B, that these forces are largely headed by people who have deep political connections. That, to me, is the really serious issue here. We don't know how many Iraqis are being killed every day. We don't know about the operations of these companies. It's a very serious problem.
As I get back to Nick, let's take another quick look at Shadow Company, the documentary he's made. Very interesting documentary. And this is where an Aussie is writing a letter home and it's being narrated. Let's listen to this.
Hi all. In brief, for those of you who don't already know, I quit the job at the law firm and I'm now working for a private security company in Iraq. I'm on a 6 on, 3 off rotation, 6 weeks on, 3 weeks off. The contract is huge, 200 men doing close protection tasks, or PSD as the Americans call it. There are swarms of other firms of private contractors all over the place, some complete cowboy outfits. But this one is fairly sharp, so I'm not too worried about getting killed. Besides, I've promised Debbie, Jill, Alice and Natasha that I'll come back alive.
He's Scottish, actually, not Australian. But Nick, if I could ask you to answer, as we discuss this, an email from Paula in the United Kingdom who says, throughout history, it's only cash-rich, democratically weak regimes that resort to using mercenaries. It backfires on them eventually, and the gains made are always short-term. Do you think there's any truth in that?
It's a it's a gross generalization, and I suspect there's sometimes truth in that. Based on the research that we did for the making of Shadow Company, there are certainly been some instances where private actors were used in a very positive fashion. For example, it's generally accepted that in 1995 in Sierra Leone, a South African mercenary company by the name of Executive Outcomes provided 150 men who essentially fought against a rebel force of 15,000. Massively were involved in preventing the bloodshed and stabilizing that country. However, when they left, and as it happens, they were forced to leave by the international community because the international community thought, we can't have mercenaries there, these guys have just got to get out. When they left, the country erupted again, and the UN took significantly more money and significantly more time to stabilize the scenario again. But yeah, it's quite possible that it's difficult to prove that there's a long-term stability once the security forces leave. There's a big difference between peacemaking and peacekeeping, and this is one of the big problems that I think we still have to solve, because the UN certainly is a broken tool for doing things like this.
Well, Nick Bicanic and Jeremy Scahill, we have run out of time. Lots more questions, but we don't have time for them. We do hope to speak with you both again. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Riz.
Thank you very much.
And you, thanks for being with us, and hope you join us for the next show where we interview outspoken Palestinian legislator and activist Dr. Hanan Ashrawi. Don't forget, if you have any questions for Dr. Ashrawi or any thoughts about pressing issues around the world, send your emails to riz@aljazeera.net. We'll see you next time. Street Talk's coming up next.